I never imagined I'd be back under those glittering lights. The Pacific Grand Hotel's rooftop was dressed in ivory linens, crystal chandeliers, and the low hum of conversation drifting across Chicago's skyline. It was the annual Meridian Arts Gala, a who's who of philanthropists, gallery owners, and socialites. For me, Morgan Caldwell, age 42, it was my first public appearance in nearly 2 decades. I wasn't there for the spotlight. I had another reason, one tied to a promise broken long ago. I didn't arrive alone. I stepped onto the marble terrace flanked by 4 young people, all striking in their own right. Ava, 17, tall and poised. Nolan, 15, whose gray-blue eyes held a steady intelligence. Cole, 12, broad-shouldered and quiet. And Mia, 9, with a mischievous half-smile. Together we moved like a small constellation, each star drawing curious glances. My heart jolted the moment I felt that one stare slice through the crowd. He stood by the fountain as if conjured by my memories. Ethan Caldwell, salt and pepper hair, slicked back tuxedo tailored to the inch. He still carried himself with the same confidence that once drew me in. Back then, he vowed he'd never leave me. Then, 17 years ago, he walked away the instant he learned I couldn't conceive naturally. That was the night my world cracked open. Now he looked startled. His gaze flicked from me to the 4 faces at my side. His eyes widened as he registered each resemblance: Ava's high cheekbones, Nolan's sharp jaw, Cole's intense stare, Mia's crooked grin. He lifted one trembling hand toward his glass of champagne, trying to steady nerve and drink. "Morgan." His voice barely rose above the jazz piano. I met his gaze coolly, not with anger exactly, but with the calm of someone who'd survived every shade of heartbreak. "This is my family," I said, voice even. "Ava, Nolan, Cole, and Mia." He opened his mouth, closed it. The crowd swirled around us, oblivious to the tsunami rippling between us. I realized then Ethan Caldwell, the man who'd once expected a perfect life, was confronting something he never saw coming. He took a hesitant step forward, and I held my breath, knowing this night was just the beginning. As soon as I stepped off the elevator in the quiet of my Lincoln Park townhouse, the air felt thicker, like the world had shifted back on its axis the moment Ethan's gaze landed on me. I paused in the foyer, my hand on the cool brass doorknob, and took a measured breath. Tonight, the gala's glamour still danced behind my eyelids, the way the candlelight played off his salt and pepper hair, the rigid line of his jaw when he realized those 4 young faces defied every expectation he held of me. I closed my eyes and let my memories settle into resolve. I had spent 17 years teaching myself to stand tall on 2 legs, success as an independent art consultant, the fierce loyalty of my children, late-night whispers to my empty pillow. But seeing him again stirred something raw, a challenge to the foundation I'd built stone by stone. In the living room, the white camellia bloom I'd placed in a slender vase this morning caught the lamplight, its petals pristine yet perched on a slender stem that leaned just slightly to one side. It was a perfect symbol of my life, unbroken but bending under pressure. I let my fingers brush a fallen petal on the coffee table, wondering if an invitation to Ethan could crack my hard-earned calm. My phone lay on the velvet ottoman. I'd drafted a message to him 4 times already, deleting and rewriting each sentence to balance honesty with caution. Was I bold enough to ask him here into the world I'd made for our children without him? My heart hammered not with fear of him, but with the fear of letting go of a future that had already survived his absence. I lifted the phone thumb, hovering, and thought of Ava's curious smile, Nolan's probing questions, Cole's silent strength, Mia's mischievous grin. They deserved a father's presence only if he could honor the risks he'd taken by returning. With a decisive flick, I sent the text, "Can we meet tomorrow afternoon? I have something you need to see." My pulse thundered as I watched the read receipt appear. My door stood between 2 worlds, one of careful solitude and one of uncertain reunions, and I didn't know which side I'd choose once the knock finally came. Morning light poured through the living room windows, painting the hardwood floor in long golden rectangles. I'd arranged an old artist's easel in the corner, draping a charcoal-dusted canvas across it to catch any passing eyes and provoke curiosity. This was my chosen stage, the open-plan loft I used on weekends to coach local painting workshops, now repurposed for a riskier performance. I had told no one, neither the kids nor my closest friends, about meeting Ethan here. The twist was mine to direct. Mornings in my loft always carried the scent of linseed oil and fresh Rotunda coffee, but today it pulsed with tension. Each brushstroke on that blank canvas felt like a heartbeat, reminding me that creation and destruction could coexist on the same surface. I arranged 4 small stools in a semicircle facing the easel, then retreated to the opposite wall, tracing a single crack in the plaster where the building had settled years ago. It was an ugly flaw, yet strangely beautiful because it reminded me nothing stays uniform forever. Social judgments hovered at the edges of my mind, whispers in the township about the abandoned wife columns praising my self-reliance but pitying my single mother status. I'd rejected those labels, yet here I was staging an ambush of forgiveness or confrontation, one that could shatter my family's peace or stitch us together again. At precisely 2:15 p.m., Ethan's silhouette appeared in the glass-paneled door backlit by a pale Chicago sky. My stomach clenched, but I straightened my spine and beckoned him inside. Without a word, he crossed the threshold, eyes skimming the faded wooden floorboards, and the 4 miniature canvases I'd propped on the easel. I watched the conflict flash across his face. Was it regret, curiosity, fear, and wondered which of us would break silence first. Ethan stood before the row of kid-sized paintings, a wind-swept tree under stormy skies, a brick-red cityscape dotted with yellow windows, a rainbow stitched through charcoal clouds, and a pair of hands reaching toward one another against a blank horizon. Each image reflected the years I'd coaxed the children to process their own stories through brush and pigment. I saw his hand tremble as he turned to me. "Morgan," he said, voice low. "What is all this?" I felt the old familiar spark, the risk of exposing every emotion I'd kept hidden. My heart found its rhythm in defiance. "This is their language," I replied, "and today you get to learn it." He swallowed, stepping closer until he could see the fine cracks in the paint, tiny fractures that spoke of stress, but also of resilience. I crossed my arms, feeling my inner strength like a taut wire ready to conduct any shock. "I wanted you to see what they've built without you," I said. "And also what they'll build if you choose to stay." His gaze shifted as Nolan's painting, an abstract maze of gray lines leading to a small red dot, caught his eye, and I saw the first trace of something tender. But before he could reach out to touch the canvas, the loft's only phone buzzed with a text from Ava. "Mom, where's the sugar for my corn muffins?" The mundane reminder crashed into the charged atmosphere like a surprise thunderclap. Ethan flinched, guilt and longing pooling in his expression, and I realized that our reunion hinged on whether he could embrace ordinary moments with as much courage as this extraordinary one. I led him to the small kitchen off the loft, its yellow subway tile warm and retro. The sight of 4 mismatched mugs drying on the rack transformed the room into a home again, not a museum for pain, but a sanctuary of small comforts. I opened the cupboard to reveal 2 open bags of flour, white all-purpose and whole wheat rye. "They're experimenting with muffin recipes," I said, trying to keep my tone steady though my pulse raced. "They'll need you in about 10 minutes. The words felt like an offer of admission to a club he'd once abandoned, and I noticed his shoulders slump slightly. He reached for the flour, brushing his fingers over the measuring cups as though memorizing their curvature. In that moment, I recognized his genuine willingness to risk looking foolish in front of my children, something I had always admired and resented. I could feel my own beliefs wobble. I'd long held that a woman could thrive without a man's support, that the scars of abandonment proved more than any risk a partnership could offer. Yet here was Ethan stepping into my kitchen as if crossing a battlefield, prepared to entangle himself in the messy joy of everyday life. When Cole bounded in wearing an apron 2 sizes too big, cone-striped like a carnival, and Mia darted behind him with a wooden spoon in hand, the world tilted on its axis again. Ava and Nolan appeared at the back door, flour dusting their sneakers. All 4 stopped cold at the sight of Ethan holding a mixing bowl, uncertain whether to freeze or rush forward. Their eyes were ships lost at sea, scanning for safe harbor. And I wondered, would they let him land? Moments later, the kitchen erupted into flour-scented chaos. Nolan insisted on measuring the baking soda himself. Cole dumped half the sugar in by accident, a white avalanche that coated the counter. Mia skidded across the tile floor as she reached for the vanilla, nearly smashing the bottle. Ava steadied her younger siblings with calm laughter. Ethan watched it all from the doorway, a curious mix of nostalgia and regret filling his eyes. I stayed silent, letting the scene unfold, because my greatest test wasn't in demanding he prove himself, it was in resisting the urge to rescue him from his own discomfort. Symbolically, the spilled sugar and rogue spoon were like my own messy path, beautiful in its imperfection, ripe for redemption. As the oven timer dinged, Cole opened the door too soon, and a trail of muffins collapsed into a flat, syrupy puddle. Nolan reacted with horror, but Ethan stepped forward, his voice warm and steady. "It's okay, let's call them pancake muffins." His quick humor broke the tension, and for a sliver of a second, I saw the man I loved beneath the armor he'd forged. But as he offered Cole a hand and ruffled his hair, I realized that welcome can feel like permission, and I might live to regret giving it so soon. The oven door loomed like a gateway between past mistakes and future promise, and I had to decide whether to close it or leave it wide open. When afternoon light softened into early dusk, we carried the half-collapsed muffins and a pitcher of iced tea out to the rooftop deck, where the gala had dazzled us just a night before. The city's skyscrapers stood quiet witnesses as the children gathered around our feet, chattering about color theory and crumb texture. Ethan poured tea into their small glasses, his hands firm, respectful, as if learning how to handle them anew. I watched his reflection in the glass railing, a man remade by small acts of courage rather than grand gestures. But my mind churned with the social contradictions I'd wrestled with all these years, the narrative that painted single mothers as victims, the pride I took in proving everyone wrong, and the vulnerability of letting someone share the burden. Here was Ethan reaching out to claim a place in a story I'd been writing alone. I knew it wasn't his right, it was mine to grant. I leaned against the wind-chilled railing, my pulse calm and electric. My children's laughter rose in the air, their shadows mingling with his, weaving a tapestry neither past regret nor future hope could fully define. I realized then that real strength wasn't in standing apart. It was in knowing when to stand together, risking fresh wounds to forge new bonds. But as a lone cloud drifted across the blood-orange sky, I felt the weight of the question I hadn't voiced. Could I truly let him in without losing myself? The sky darkened and city lights flickered on, echoing the stars above. We sat there, a family reconfigured, before the night sky, sipping tea from the same pitcher, sharing crumbs of broken muffins. Ethan turned to me, his eyes steady in the dusk. "Thank you," he said, voice low enough only I could hear, "for giving me this chance." I met his gaze, feeling a quiet thunderclap in my chest, the knowledge that love demands vulnerability, that redemption requires both courage and mercy. I thought of the white camellia in my foyer, its single fallen petal, and traced the memory of sending that text. Now the question hung between us, as real and fragile as a sugar dust coating. Did I trust him enough to surrender the story I'd been writing alone for 17 years? My heartbeat drummed like a decision waiting to be made. And as Ethan reached out his hand, I knew the answer would shape every chapter yet to come. But first, I had to find the words to say yes. I stood on the rooftop deck long after the gala's lights dimmed and the crowds thinned, feeling the night air settle around me like a question I hadn't yet answered. Ethan's hand hovered in mid-air palm up the last glow of the city, flickering across the fine lines of his skin, and I felt the weight of his waiting as if it were the hinge of my life swinging on a single decision. I remembered the camellia in my foyer, its white petals kissed by morning light, and the solitary one that had fallen the moment I decided to meet him, that perfect imperfection, becoming a silent emblem of everything I'd built and everything I'd lost. For 17 years, I had stood alone, carving a home and heart for 4 children with every ounce of grit I could summon. I had preached independence like scripture, masking the hollow ache beneath triumphs that once felt hollow without someone to share them. But tonight, confronted by the man who once made promises he couldn't keep, I felt something flicker inside me, daring hope that a heart courageous enough to risk might learn to beat in harmony again. The risk felt colossal. If I took his hand, I flung open the doors to old wounds and fresh betrayals. If I walked away, I would lock us all into a half-finished story that began in love and collapsed in silence. Around us, Chicago's skyscrapers stood as silent witnesses, their windows glowing like unblinking eyes, unaware how a single moment could reshape our world. I tightened my grip on the iron railing, tasting the salt of fear and possibility on my tongue, my pulse echoing like distant thunder. I remembered how many nights I'd lain awake listening to the hush of an empty bedroom, tracing the faint echo of broken vows on the ceiling. I recalled the think pieces praising me as the triumphant single mom, lauding my every career victory while glossing over the raw ache behind my measured smile. Society had demanded I prove a mother alone was enough, and I had adorned each success with the badge of self-sufficiency. But he was here now, and survival alone suddenly felt inadequate. Each heartbeat felt like a drum counting down to a verdict I couldn't postpone, and somewhere deep in my chest, a stubborn ember of courage refused to be extinguished by cynicism. And so I hesitated. The world narrowing to his outstretched hand, and the choice before me, would I let him in? The next morning began with sunlight filtering through linen curtains, splashing the hardwood floors with lazy rectangles of gold. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead and arranged 4 backpacks at the foot of the stairs, each one stuffed with lunchboxes and permission slips. The air smelled of toasted almonds and fresh beginnings, an irony I couldn't escape as I watched the clock tick toward school drop-off. At precisely 7:45 a.m., a knock sounded at the front door, and there he was on the porch wearing a navy windbreaker and an expression that balanced hope against apprehension. I could hear my own breathing steady but sharp as I opened the door and greeted him by name, my voice calm, even though my heart felt like a bird flapping against its cage. I led him down the hallway past the framed sketches of my children. Ava's self-portrait in acrylic blues, Nolan's charcoal cityscape, Cole's bold watercolor strokes, Mia's playful collage of magazine fragments, and I realized I was inviting him into a world he had once abandoned. We walked to the car in silence, the neighborhood waking around us, a neighbor watering begonias, a jogger's footsteps on pavement, children's voices drifting from a schoolyard down the block. I slid into the driver's seat and handed Ethan the keys, surprising even myself. When he glanced at me, confusion and gratitude warring in his eyes, I pointed toward the school zone. "You want to drop them off?" I asked, offering a small invitation into my daily rhythm. He nodded, throat tight, and slipped behind the wheel as if stepping onto shifting ground. The risk of letting him drive our children through morning traffic felt massive, but the real gamble was letting down my guard. At the crosswalk, a familiar face leaned over the fence. Mrs. Harris, the town's unofficial judge, eyeing Ethan with thinly veiled curiosity. Her arched eyebrow spoke volumes, She wondered if this man had any business here. I met Ethan's gaze in the rearview mirror and saw the doubt flicker, then fade as he guided the car forward, keeping pace with the bright yellow school bus. I realized then that life's greatest risks often arrive disguised as mundane routines. Would I trust him with the simple task of caring for my children, or would I guard my solitude too fiercely to notice how much braver he was willing to be? By mid-morning, the kitchen table was strewn with half-eaten toast, scattered juice boxes, and a cracked ceramic mug I'd accidentally chipped the day before. I poured myself a second cup of coffee while Ethan filled the dishwasher with breakfast plates, his movements careful and unhurried. I watched as he reached for a rag to wipe up a dribble of milk, mindful of the small details that once charmed me and now measured his willingness to belong. With each cup he washed and each crumb he swept off the counter, he risked looking out of place in my carefully calibrated world. I found myself testing him casually, inviting him to try my mom's special oatmeal recipe, tossing out instructions only to see if he'd follow through. When I noticed the toast was slightly burnt, I raised an eyebrow. "You mind?" I asked, voice light. He braced, then retrieved a fresh slice, and this small correction felt like a promise made in ordinary acts, no grand gestures, just involvement. I felt a twist in my heart, fear that he might overstep and controlling instinct to micromanage colliding with a desire to let go. We had clashed on everything once upon a time, from paintbrush angles in my first solo show to stoic disagreements in boardrooms. Now I wondered if I could let him share the chore of daily life without fear it would unravel the fragile stability I'd fought for. A morning sunbeam fell across the chipped mug on the counter, splitting it in half like the choices stretched before me, clinging to independence or embracing a partner's imperfect but earnest efforts. I steeled myself against the older, wounded version of me that would control every detail. I took a breath, acknowledging that love often grows in messy kitchens. And as Ethan placed the last plate in the rack, I realized the risk had never been about burnt toast, but about trusting him with second chances. Could I let him take that risk? In the afternoon, I coaxed the children to my makeshift art studio behind the townhouse, a room draped in drop cloths and airy with slanted light from skylights. I told them to set up their easels for a surprise lesson, and they chirped with excitement, imagining whatever creative musings I'd devised. I watched as Ava mixed oils on her palette, Nolan sharpened charcoal sticks, Cole arranged water jars, and Mia rummaged for glue sticks. Then I turned to Ethan, who lingered at the doorway, hands stuffed in pockets, clearly uncertain how to help. Without thinking, I handed him a palette knife, asking him to scrape away excess paint on a communal canvas we'd left half-finished, broad sweeping strokes in crimson and ochre, a phoenix frozen mid-flight. He blinked, then leaned in, carefully carving shapes from the wet pigment. The motion was awkward, at first hesitant slashes of metal against dried paint, but there was a deliberate gentleness in how he removed layers, revealing brighter tones beneath. My breath caught in one gesture. He wasn't dominating the canvas nor fading into the background. He was embracing the art of listening, erasing mistakes without erasing meaning. Behind us, the children paused, watching his every move. I could see admiration flicker in their eyes, curiosity replacing wariness. But as he stepped back, pride shining in his expression, I felt an internal conflict flare. I'd always believed that a powerful woman didn't need a partner to lead. Yet here was a man showing me how trust could be wrought in modest, collaborative acts. A roll of tape hissed against the floor as Cole secured a torn paper and Nolan murmured, "He's not bad, is he?" Their words hovered in the air like an unspoken hypothesis. I had to answer for myself. I swallowed hard, realizing that social expectations had painted relationships as either epic triumphs or catastrophic failures, ignoring the quiet, painstaking work in between. I stepped forward, brushing a stray lock of hair from Ethan's forehead, and whispered, "Thank you," even though I wasn't sure whom I meant for his help or for the lesson he'd taught me. And as the children returned to their stations, the canvas stood half-healed and half-wild, a testament to the risk and reward of shared creation, leaving me to wonder whether I could embrace the unexpected masterpiece he offered. That evening, I invited my oldest friend Claire over for dinner, thinking her clear-sighted pragmatism would help me make sense of the tangled emotions coursing through me. I prepared pasta with tomato basil sauce, something simple enough that conversation could take center stage. Claire arrived hair loose and laughter ready, but paused at the doorway when she saw Ethan sitting at the table quietly slicing bread. Her eyes flicked to me, a question unvoiced, then to him, suspicion flickering across her features. I braced myself. Claire had championed my independence for years, fine-tuning my armor against disappointment. Over steaming bowls of pasta, I told a clipped version of the morning's events, emphasizing the children's acceptance and Ethan's tentative steps. Claire listened, arms crossed, and finally sighed. "Morgan, I admire your strength, but be careful you don't trade one prison for another," she said, twirling her fork. "You've done so well on your own. Why invite risk back in?" Her words cut sharper than any rebuke because they were rooted in love and concern. I felt my chest tighten, a storm gathering behind my ribs as I wrestled with social voices praising single mothers as heroic and condemning those who dared soften. I realized the real fault line wasn't in trusting Ethan, but in letting go of the rigid beliefs that had kept me safe and lonely. I looked at him, then hands stained with flour and paint, eyes downcast yet open, and knew Claire's caution was both wise and incomplete. Life demanded we balance caution with courage. Before I could formulate a reply, a sharp crack echoed as Claire's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor in a spray of ruby droplets. The moment froze, shards glittered like broken promises in the lamplight, and all three of us held our breath, caught between fear and possibility. And in that fragment of silence, I realized my next answer would define everything. Late into the night, after Claire left and the children were tucked into bed, I found myself in the hallway outside Ethan's spare room, staring at the closed door as if it were a barrier between two lives. I could hear his steady breathing and wondered what dreams might stir behind that thin barrier, dreams of regret, of future hopes, or of a past he still carried in his bones. I retreated to my bedroom, running a hand over the camellia that stood crooked in its vase petals, wilting at the edges, a quiet mirror of my own uncertainties. I crawled into bed, the memory of shattered glass and simmering doubts echoing in my mind. Before sleep claimed me, I sent a message to each of the kids. "Tell him goodnight if you see him." I knew they might or might not, but the act was symbolic, offering him a small thread of belonging. My phone glowed once with a reply from Mia. He said, "Sweet dreams, Mom." That single line felt like a lifeline and a challenge, an invitation to trust that our fractured family could stitch itself together again. I closed my eyes on that thought, the boundary between past and future dizzyingly porous. And as the first light of dawn tiptoed through the curtains, I realized my greatest test lay ahead, not in grand declarations or sweeping vows, but in the small, unguarded moments that would determine whether we could heal or fall apart. The question that echoed in my heart refused to be silenced, and could I truly let him share in our story without losing the woman I'd become? I waited at the school gate in the soft drizzle of an autumn morning. The sidewalk cracked like old paint beneath my feet. Muffled footsteps approached as I saw Ethan's car pull up, brake lights glowing like hesitant apologies. He rolled down the window and offered a small, awkward smile. Behind him, our children buckled in their seats, staring at me as if I signaled something momentous. In that moment, I realized how fiercely I'd guarded them for 17 years, built walls of self-reliance so high that letting someone else drive my kids felt like handing over pieces of my own heart. The air smelled of damp concrete and renewal, a contradiction that mirrored my own turmoil. I craved partnership, yet feared vulnerability. Mrs. Harris, our neighbor, raised a single brow as Ethan opened the car door for Ava first, then Nolan, then Cole, and Mia. Her unspoken question, "Does that man belong here?" hung in the mist. I forced a light cough, bending to greet each child, reminding myself that social scripts often demanded nuclear families as ideals. But love, I believed, could reshape any tradition. We exchanged polite hellos with her before setting off for home. Every block we crossed felt like uncharted territory, trusting Ethan with morning routines, with safety, with the smallest rituals that define a family's rhythm. I recognized my own heartbeat strong and pounding, the proof of risk as a living thing. When I glanced back at the cracked pavement, I made a silent promise to hold both fear and hope in my hands and to see which one guided my steps next. That afternoon, I pushed open the door to the Wilson Elementary cafeteria where fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and a makeshift PTA meeting was in full swing. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of neighborhood parents' agendas clutched like battle plans for the year ahead, bake sale schedules, book drive quotas, hallway mural volunteers. I led Ethan to an empty seat near the front, feeling a twinge of defiance and protectiveness. Inviting him into this space full of well-meaning parents who'd whispered behind my back about the abandoned wife was deliberate rebellion. As our names were called for introductions, I watched him swallow past the dryness in his throat. He stood, clearing his voice, and spoke of wanting to help in whatever way possible: room, parent, volunteer, chaperone, behind-the-scenes support. His words stumbled initially, but he found footing when Nolan's painting of a city skyline caught the organizer's eye, and he recounted how Nolan had taught him to see art in the everyday. I felt my chest tighten, both proud and terrified. He was weaving himself into our world through honesty and humility, exactly the moral I'd taught my kids about redemption. The room erupted in polite applause, but just as I allowed myself to relax, the sound of papers rustling signaled his next move, and I realized that every gesture here carried the weight of public scrutiny. 2 days later, I hosted a community bake sale fundraiser at St. Mark's Church, its stained glass windows catching afternoon light like fragments of kaleidoscopes. Pews stood empty behind rows of folding tables laden with pies, cupcakes, and Ethan's specialty pumpkin bars with salted caramel drizzle. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. Pride in small things can be as meaningful as grand gestures. I watched him carefully slice pie with deliberate patience, dusting his apron free of flour before offering a plate to a curious passerby. But when a woman from the church's board gasped in recognition, "Aren't you Gabriel Reed from Reed Enterprises?" the entire line shuddered with surprise. Ethan's polite nod and gentle correction, "It's Ethan Caldwell now," landed like a pivot in our lives, exposing the tension between reputations built on wealth and hearts rebuilt in humility. Whispers floated around us about corporate tycoons, about single mothers who settle. I felt my pulse spike at the collision of social worlds, my activism against inequality, his immersion in privilege. Still, he kept serving slices as though every plate were a pact, and I realized how much I'd needed someone to help shoulder the burden of judgment. The moment the church bell rang for Vespers, signaling an end to the sale, I felt a tremor of conflict, grateful for his help, yet terrified of the gossip that could fracture our fragile progress. That night, I found him in the kitchen leaning against the counter as I prepared herbal tea. Shadows from the lace curtains danced across his face, highlighting the hint of uncertainty in his eyes. I asked about his day, the PTA, the bake sale, the crushed pumpkin bars that barely held their shape. His reply was candid. "I've never felt more out of place and more at home." His honesty struck me like a sudden chord. We talked deep into the night, voices low about our clashing beliefs, my conviction that capitalism needed accountability, his belief in rebuilding communities through enterprise. The teacup warmed my fingers, even as the conversation grew heated, opposing views on corporate donations versus grassroots activism colliding over saucers and steam. At one point, I slammed the cup onto the counter, the clatter echoing like a judge's gavel. We stared at each other in the sudden silence, the fragile pieces of compromise scattered like spilled tea leaves. My heart pounded with the logic twist I hadn't expected that the man I once judged for leaving needed me now to accept him as imperfect as I was. And in that charged hush, I knew the choice I made next could either stitch us closer or rip us apart, leaving only echoes in an empty kitchen. Before dawn crept through the window, I found an old letter in my jewelry box tucked inside a tarnished silver locket engraved with my grandmother's initials. Her handwriting, looping and graceful, reminded me of resilience in the face of social storms, how she'd raised 5 children alone during the Depression, and swore that community was stronger than solitude. I sat in the living room reading her words by the soft glow of a single lamp, advice to trust the ones who risk their reputations for love, to hold hope as sacred as faith. My eyes stung with tears I'd long denied as weakness, and I realized the power of multi-generational wisdom clashing with my own modern cynicism. The locket felt warm in my palm, a symbol that love, like metal, could be bent and polished over time without losing its integrity. I made a silent vow to honor both my grandmother's courage and my own hard-won independence, forging a path where partnership and self-reliance coexisted. As the clock ticked toward morning, I dialed Ethan's number, my fingers trembling, and left a message: "Meet me on the roof at sunrise." The line clicked dead, and I pressed my forehead against the handset, knowing that tomorrow's light would demand a choice I could no longer avoid. At first light, I climbed the spiral staircase to the rooftop deck, the city still draped in dawn's chill. Tables and chairs remained from the gala, but I'd stolen away the silk drapes to let the sky's pale wash in without pretense. The wind tugged at my hair as I arranged 4 wooden stools around a small table, holding the tarnished locket and a single white camellia, the flower that bore witness to every risk I'd taken since seeing Ethan again. He emerged a moment later, coat in hand, eyes steady but vulnerable. We stood face to face for a stretch of time that felt like both an eternity and the briefest heartbeat, the skyline unfolding behind him as if urging us on. I held the locket out, voice soft. "I've lived 17 years with half a picture. Here's the rest of it if you're brave enough to see." His breath caught, and I watched tears pool in his eyes. Tears of regret, relief, and something deeper I hadn't yet named. He reached for the camellia next, cradling the petals like promise. As he opened the locket, exposing my grandmother's scrawled wisdom and the faded photograph inside, I realized we stood on the threshold of a new story, one that demanded both of us risk everything we thought we needed. And as the wind lifted the petals from the camellia and carried them over the city, I knew this moment would be the hinge between who we were and who we might become. The morning after our rooftop dawn meeting, I stood in the echoing white gallery hall where the Meridian Arts Foundation auction was set to begin, the walls lined with local artists' work alongside the canvases our family had created together. I pinned a single white camellia soft petals, still perfect, onto my lapel, a symbol of both fragility and resilience, then took a measured breath. Every step toward the center of the room felt like crossing a tightrope. On one side lay the safety I had carved alone, on the other the possibility of true partnership. My hands trembled slightly as I placed an easel holding the children's collaborative phoenix painting. By the entrance, a bold image of wings unfolding from charcoal embers. The social elite filtered in, murmuring polite approval or skeptical whispers about a single mother involving her kids in public spectacle. I felt the weight of their gazes, the architecture of privilege pressing in. Yet even as doubt threatened to rise, I summoned the inner strength I'd honed over 17 years of solo parenting, the instinct to stand guard over my family's triumphs, to shield our story from judgment. I sensed the auctioneer clearing his throat at the podium, the hush sweeping across the room like a tide. Heart-pounding, I met Ethan's gaze, steady, supportive, and wondered if I had the courage to let this chapter be judged on its own merits. Would our blended family's art fetch acceptance, or would the critiques shatter the fragile wings we'd just learned to unfurl? As the bidding began, the auctioneer's voice rang out. First lot, the Caldwell family Phoenix, estimated at $2,000 to $3,000. A hush fell, then tentative paddles rose. I watched the numbers climb 3, 4, 5 until a sharp voice cut through. I question whether this truly meets professional standards, drawled a benefactor I'd once counted among my closest supporters, now turned critic. He leaned forward, lacquered finger tapping the microphone. Should we value such raw amateur work over seasoned artists who've dedicated a lifetime to their craft? The room stiffened. I felt panic bloom in my chest. The bid stalled. My palms grew slick. Memories of past art shows where I'd been dismissed for my youth, my single status surging forward. Just as the price threatened to stall below reserve, Ethan rose, paddle in hand, voice firm enough to carry across the hall. I'll start at $6,000. Gasps fluttered through the guests. Some exchanged glances, puzzled. He held my eye, nodding an unspoken promise that he'd bear the risk of investing not just money, but belief in our family's vision. The bid soared, and soon the paddle returned to him again and again, reaching 7-8 until it closed at $9,000, nearly triple the estimate. The room exploded into polite applause, but I could still feel the critic's sour stare. In that thunderous moment, I realized our greatest victory wasn't the hammer price, but Ethan's choice to stand with us publicly. Yet, as I watched him settle back into his chair, pride and relief tangled with a question I couldn't shake. Had he risked too much? And would the glow of that bid hold us together or expose new fractures? Later backstage in the gallery's preparation room, I found Ethan leaning against a folding table strewn with half-empty wine glasses and discarded staplers. One glass lay shattered on the floor shards like fallen stars at our feet, an apt symbol for the fragile beauty of this venture. I crossed my arms, steadying my voice. You didn't have to outbid everyone. You could have let it go. He glanced at the broken glass, then back at me, eyes tired but earnest. If we're going to rewrite our story, it can't be small gestures. It has to be real risk. His words struck me like cold water, the twist I'd never expected, the realization that promises alone weren't enough, that real change demanded acts that might break us. I thought of the social tension we'd just navigated, the old guard who saw raw family art as a novelty, not genuine expression. I weighed my belief in independence against the power of united purpose. For a heartbeat, fear reared. What if our unity crumbled under higher stakes? Yet even as uncertainty gnawed at me, I felt a steel rod of resolve sink into my spine. Then we keep choosing risk, I said softly. He nodded, and together we stared at the scattered fragments on the floor, knowing some things must shatter before they can be rebuilt. But as I turned to leave, the door swung open on its own, and outside stood the benefactor from earlier, face unreadable, forcing me to wonder if our victory would withstand scrutiny beyond this room. The next morning, I arrived at the community center where the children volunteered with me to teach art classes for underprivileged kids. My belief in grassroots work had always been sacred. I'd spent years lobbying for art programs in low-income neighborhoods, convinced that creativity could bridge social divides. Ethan followed quietly, carrying a stack of donated supplies from his company's foundation. We set up paint tubes and sketch pads on folding tables, and the kids began to trickle in wide-eyed at the sudden promise of color in drab hallways. As I demonstrated a watercolor technique, I caught a glimpse of Ethan across the room, patiently kneeling beside a young girl who struggled to hold her brush. His cuffed sleeves and crisp shirt seemed out of place amid the worn linoleum and chipped plaster. A subtle tension pulsed my conviction that corporate involvement risked tainting pure community efforts, clashing with the reality that his resources could enhance our mission. When the girl's painting cracked with too much water, she pouted and Ethan scooped her up in a gentle embrace, whispering encouragement. I felt the tug of old beliefs war with fresh gratitude. Perhaps my fear of privilege had blinded me to the power of partnership in service. But as I prepared to offer him a smile of reconciliation, a teacher from the rival art program cornered me in the hallway. Voice low, "Are you really okay letting corporate money into this room? They'll charge us collaboration fees before long." His accusation hit like a thrown stone, and I realized that our shared risk had become fodder for division. I straightened, heart thundering, watching Ethan lead the girl back to the painting table with patient focus. In that charged corridor, I wondered which belief would prevail, my vow to protect community purity, or the truth that sometimes change requires crossing lines we once vowed never to breach. That evening, I slipped away to my studio loft, seeking solitude, amid dry turpentine and blank canvases. The walls bore the imprints of every project I'd led, sketches of cityscapes, collages from newspaper fragments, smudged charcoal portraits of children I'd mentored. I lit a single candle whose flame danced defiantly against the dark, its flicker a reminder that creativity often flourishes in uncertainty. My phone buzzed with messages, our auction-winning volunteers praising Ethan's care with the young artists, and a final line from him. "Meet me at Clover and Vine at 8. His timing was deliberate. He'd remembered how I loved the little cafe that closed every day at 8:30. I sipped my tea, tasting hope and apprehension in equal measure. If I went, I'd be stepping into the warmth of our budding partnership, but I'd also be acknowledging that I needed him in ways I'd resisted admitting. I stared at the blank canvas across the room, imagining how I might translate this turning point into paint. The logic twist I faced was clear. I had always told myself that self-sufficiency was the ultimate strength. Yet here I was, craving the collaboration that once terrified me. I snuffed the candle, leaving the studio in darkness, and felt the weight of choice settle over me like a cloak. As I headed out into the crisp night air, the locket from my grandmother lay heavy in my pocket, reminding me that courage often comes wrapped in contradictions. I paused at the door, breath visible in the cold, ready to take the next step, but uncertain if my heart was strong enough to embrace the full risk he was asking me to share. The street lamp outside Clover and Vine flickered as I pushed open the glass door, the bell's soft chime, carrying a quiet promise of new beginnings. Inside, the cafe's warm glow wrapped around us, contrasting with the cool autumn breeze that clung to my coat. Ethan sat at our usual corner table, 2 mugs of chai latte steaming between us. I felt the locket heavy against my chest, the camellia pin still crisp on my coat lapel. This ritual, simple and personal, had become our sanctuary, a reminder that love finds shape in shared routines. Yet as I slid into the seat opposite him, my heart pounded with the risk of revealing the final piece of my truth. He looked up, relief easing his shoulders, but I saw the question in his eyes. What now? I let the moment stretch, tasting the chai's bittersweet sweetness, then reached into my pocket and placed the grandmother's locket on the table. Its silver surface caught the cafe's light, fracturing into warm reflections. Ethan's breath caught as he traced the initials inside. I thought of my grandmother's words and how they had guided me through fear and doubt. Now they beckoned him toward our shared horizon. I drew a deep breath and spoke of the final twist that I had once resisted: corporate involvement in community art, only to discover that partnership could amplify impact when guided by genuine intent. I admitted my deepest fear that needing someone else made me vulnerable to disappointment. As I looked at him, I saw his own vulnerability mirrored back. Our hands hovered above the locket, a silent accord hovering in the space between us, waiting for a choice that could unite or divide us once more. The next morning, sunlight pooled on the kitchen floor in honeyed ribbons as I prepared breakfast for the children. The scent of bacon mingled with fresh coffee, creating a morning anthem that felt sacred. Yet as I cracked eggs into the skillet, I found myself bracing against the echo of uncertainty that followed our cafe conversation. Could I trust myself to let Ethan remain not as a guest in our home, but as a part of its foundation? The spatula rattled in my hand, sending a fragment of eggshell skittering across the countertop. My internal voice recoiled with the urge to fling the eggshell into the trash can without thinking, to maintain control of every crumb and drip. But then I heard 4 pairs of feet bounding down the stairs, and in their laughter, I recognized the stakes of my choice. They piled into the kitchen, requesting their usual orders. Ava with scrambled eggs and toast. Nolan's omelet with salsa on the side. Cole's pancakes drenched in syrup. Mia's oatmeal crowned with brown sugar. All looked to Ethan standing by the fridge for the final yes or no. I realized the greatest act of strength I could offer was surrendering authority to let him serve coffee, to ladle oatmeal, to fill plates, just as I always had. My hand trembled as I handed him the syrup bottle, the symbolic baton of trust, and watched as he poured without hesitation. The moment stretched a simple act, yet one that whispered of our fragile brand of harmony. And as we ate together, the morning light framing our newly shared table, I sensed the first tremors of a family reborn. Yet I knew the true test of this unity would come with the inevitable storms ahead. By midday, Ethan and I walked the children to the community center for the first joint workshop he'd agreed to co-lead. The hall's windows were bright with midday glare, illuminating rows of dusty stools and half-painted murals. I saw parents' skeptical glances as we entered together, some curious, others wary of the corporate magnate stepping into their sacred space. I felt the weight of their expectations and suspicions, social lines drawn in invisible chalk. But with each step, I felt a newfound resolve that unity wasn't about erasing tension, but about leaning into it with compassion. I introduced Ethan as our partner in creativity, and his polite nod belied the tension in his jaw. We divided the room. I led a demonstration of mixed media collage while he guided a lesson on sourcing recycled materials, his corporate connections, making donations of reclaimed wood and metal possible. As the kids dove into scraps of color and texture, I watched parents' brows soften when they saw Ethan kneeling beside a shy boy, coaxing him to try the glue stick himself. In that moment, I recognized the twist of my beliefs. I had once equated self-reliance with purity, but now saw that collaboration could honor both community and resource. When I glanced at him across the table, our eyes met in mutual acknowledgement, a silent covenant that we would risk criticism together. Yet, as applause rose at workshop's end, I felt a tremor in the air. The mural's centerpiece, a phoenix emerging over a skyline, had a stray brushstroke that threatened its symmetry. Some would call it flaw. I called it truth. And as we packed up supplies, I wondered how our blended imperfections would come to define our strength. That evening, the 4 of us gathered in the living room for a new tradition game night by candlelight, chosen to commemorate the camellia's symbol of light amid darkness. A single white candle burned in the center of the coffee table, its flame dancing against the walls. I drummed my fingers on the box of cards, heart fluttering with the risk of opening up to mirth and vulnerability. Ethan settled beside me, offering a tentative smile, and the kids perched on the sofa like observers in their own unfolding story. We played charades, first lighthearted, yet revealing Ava embodied a sculptor. Chiseling stone Nolan acted out a city skyline, Cole became a lightning bolt. Mia conveyed a falling leaf spinning in wind. When it was Ethan's turn, he chose family portrait, awkwardly pantomiming a group photo. Laughter rippled as he posed with stiff arms, and for the first time in 17 years, I felt genuine delight beyond duty or defiance. But as the candle flickered, I noticed its flame leaning toward the living room window, threatened by a sudden draft. The movement was a reminder love thrives when tended, but can be snuffed by neglect. I reached out to shield the flame with my palm, an instinctive act of protection. and realized that our family's future depended on my willingness to guard us not by building walls, but by keeping the flame alive together. Yet as the candlelight quivered against the shadows, I sensed the next wind would demand more than laughter. It would demand unwavering commitment. On a crisp weekend morning, I invited Ethan to join me at the nonprofit board meeting I chaired for the Meridian Arts Council. The conference room's glass walls overlooked the park where joggers and dog walkers passed, unaware of the power dynamics inside. Community leaders gathered in folding chairs, smartphones, and notepads ready for proposals. I introduced him as my partner in every sense, earning polite applause and a few surprised murmurs. As discussion turned to funding priorities, corporate grants versus grassroots sponsorships, I felt a familiar tension stitch through the room. Long-standing board members argued for small-scale fundraisers to maintain local control. Others with corporate ties pushed for larger grants to expand reach. When it was Ethan's turn, he rose with an air of humility, acknowledging both sides. I once believed scale alone could solve problems. Now I see the value in balance, empowering local voices while providing resources they might lack. His synthesis drew nods, but one elder member challenged him. How can we trust big business not to dominate our agenda? The question hung like a gauntlet. I felt my own convictions clash, protecting community autonomy versus embracing the potential of true collaboration. Steeling myself, I spoke next. We can set clear terms, board seats, accountability measures, shared decision-making to ensure equity. This partnership can model responsible corporate citizenship. The room stilled, then murmurs of agreement spread like ripples. I saw Ethan's relief flicker, but also a new resolve ignite in his gaze. We walked out into the park afterwards, our steps echoing on the wet path. I realized that our union had become more than personal. It was a statement against social divides. Yet, as autumn leaves skittered around us, I felt the final test looming. Could we sustain this balance when pressure mounted beyond our circle? That evening, I sat alone on the rooftop deck where our journey began, the city lights sparkling like distant candles. The wind tugged at my cardigan, and I cradled a mug of chamomile tea, its warmth seeping into my palms. I watched the silhouette of the camellia bush I'd planted last spring, its white blossoms long since fallen, but the branches stood strong, ready for next year's bloom. Symbolic, I thought renewal after the fall. My thoughts drifted through the 6 months we'd traversed from that gala confrontation to shared breakfasts, community workshops, board decisions, and intimate game nights. Each step had tested my foundation, yet revealed the strength and vulnerability. I realized my internal journey mirrored the phoenix painting, rising from doubts and scorching near surrender, only to spread new wings. My phone buzzed once with a group text, Ethan arranging a surprise family photo shoot on the deck at sunrise. I felt a thrill of anticipation and a twinge of fear, another risk, another exposure. I set down my mug and traced the rim with my finger, recalling every shard of glass and every brushstroke we'd shared. I knew our story wasn't perfection. It was a tapestry of ruptures and repairs. And as the dawn's first blush painted the sky, I closed my eyes and whispered, ready knowing that embracing an uncertain future was the strongest choice of all. Story 2. My name's Ethan. I'm 30. And last Sunday, I stood outside the house I grew up in, the place that held every childhood memory I ever had, staring at the front door like an unwelcome visitor. In fact, that's exactly what my stepmother called me just 2 days before. You're just a guest here now, Ethan. That one sentence flipped a switch in my mind. So I did what no one expected. I quietly bought the house right out from under them. But that's a story for later. To understand why it came to this, you have to know how my family stopped feeling like family years ago. I was 16 when everything began unraveling. My mother, Sophia, was the heart of our home, an art teacher with a laugh that filled the kitchen, and hands that tended a backyard garden she treated like a sanctuary. She encouraged every one of my childhood dreams, from drawing castles to building tree houses. Future architect, she'd tease every time I pulled out my sketch pad. But life doesn't care about gardens or gentle mothers. Pancreatic cancer took her in 8 brutal months. I sat with her during chemo sessions, held her hair back when she was sick, and watched the woman who raised me fade away while my dad Henry slowly disappeared too, but in a different way. He wasn't there. Even when he sat in the room, it felt like he was miles away. Her funeral was small, intimate, until she showed up. Camille, the so-called wellness coach who had been in and out of our house those last few months, selling my mom on the power of green juices and positive energy. She stood far too close to Dad during the service. I remember how her hand brushed his sleeve while I was standing there numb. 3 weeks later, she moved in. Just to help, Dad claimed. Help with what exactly? Repainting my mom's yellow kitchen walls in sterile beige, tossing her clothes into charity bins without even asking me, and sleeping in the bed that still smelled like my mother. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. But then I found my mother's sketchbooks, the ones she filled with garden plans and memories, in the recycling bin. That was it. I confronted Dad. All he said was, "We need to move forward, Ethan. Camille says holding on to this stuff is keeping us stuck." Move forward. 4 months after Mom's funeral. Dad married Camille in a rushed backyard ceremony I refused to attend. My little brother Liam, who was only 12 at the time, stood there in a suit Camille had picked out for him. I stayed home sanding and varnishing a bench I made in Mom's honor. That bench later disappeared when Camille redesigned the garden for her outdoor yoga space. Dad lectured me constantly about family unity while barely acknowledging me. But it wasn't just the lectures, it was how the house changed. Mom's kitchen was stripped of all personality. Her colorful pillows replaced by bland decor Camille called mindful minimalism. Even the backyard became a graveyard of memories as Camille built a meditation deck exactly where Mom planted sunflowers. Meanwhile, bills were stacking up. My father's income as a project manager wasn't stretching far with Camille's wellness retreats, and Liam's every whim catered to. By contrast, I picked up a landscaping job after school and worked weekends at an auto shop just to make sure we didn't lose the house. I was 16 when I paid the mortgage for the first time. I remember standing at the bank with a stack of crumpled bills in my hand, the teller asking, "Is your father with you, sweetie?" I told her, "No, ma'am, he's busy finding himself." That became my life. I worked, they spent. And Liam, he thrived as the new golden child. Dad and Camille doted on him while I was left to become the house handyman, bill payer, and invisible son. Fast forward to now, I own a successful landscaping business. I have a house of my own, a truck I restored with my own 2 hands, and a company with contracts booked out over a year. Yet they still found ways to pull me back. Last Tuesday at 1 a.m., scrolling Instagram, I saw Liam's latest post. A family dinner photo at our house. There they were, Dad, Camille, and Liam, smiling around Mom's antique dining table. The caption stung, "The Foster family complete." Complete, huh, without me? My phone buzzed minutes later. A text from Liam. "Saw you viewed my story. Family dinner this Sunday. Camille really wants to see you. It's been too long." Translation, they needed something. I replied, "Can't. Big job this weekend." Which was a lie. I'd cleared my weekend just to work on my truck in peace. Then another text, "Come on, Ethan. Dad's grilling steaks. Just one dinner." That old familiar guilt twisted in my chest, even after everything I fell for it. I told myself maybe it wouldn't be so bad this time. So I agreed. Sunday afternoon, I sat outside the house, my childhood home, but I didn't get out immediately. The caramel cheesecake I'd bought sat on the passenger seat. $48 from that pretentious bakery Camille liked. It felt like an entry fee for a club that didn't want me as a member. I finally walked in and was immediately hit by that cloying scent of burning sage, a Camille trademark. The house looked nothing like the warm, colorful space it once was. Every wall was beige. Every photo was gone. In their place were trite quotes like "live, laugh, love" and abstract art pieces that felt cold. Liam ran up to greet me. He was 26 now, but still looked at me like I was the big brother who could fix everything. He was the only reason I stayed at all. But even as he hugged me, I could feel the distance. And then Dad emerged from the kitchen grilling steaks using the tools I bought him years ago. "Ethan," he said as if I were just another guest. "Glad you made it." Just a guest. That word would stick with me for what was about to come. I followed Dad's invitation with a polite nod, but something in his tone, something almost casual, made my skin crawl. Like he had rehearsed being civil just enough to get through this dinner, but wasn't planning to feel anything genuine. Camille emerged a moment later dressed in her usual flowy linen, her hair pulled back in that effortless way that screamed effort. She greeted me with that air kiss that made sure her lips didn't actually touch my cheek. "You brought my favorite cheesecake. How thoughtful," she said with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. That's when I realized this wasn't a reunion, it was a performance like everything Camille curated in this house. Dinner felt like a long audition I didn't want to attend. Liam filled the silence with stories about his graphic design side hustle, his Instagram commissions, his plans for a podcast about creative freedom. Camille clapped at every sentence while sprinkling in updates about her wellness clients and the energy work she was doing. Dad sat quietly, mostly staring at his plate, interjecting the occasional, "That's great, son," but never really looking at me. I couldn't stop noticing how I'd become invisible at this table, the very table I had once polished by hand to preserve from being sold. No one asked about my business. No one mentioned that I was the one who kept this house from foreclosure when I was 16. Then came the twist I should have seen coming. "We have some exciting news," Camille announced as she placed a perfectly manicured hand on Dad's. "We're remodeling the master suite, finally making it a true wellness sanctuary." Liam clapped, his enthusiasm so genuine and so blind that I almost felt bad for him. "We were hoping," Camille continued, turning toward me, "now that you could help us. You have such great supplier connections. And your taste, you inherited that from your mother." The audacity of invoking my mother's name almost made me laugh out loud. I didn't even have to ask what help meant. She laid it out anyway, $30,000, $1,000, renovation, $18,000 short, and they thought I could invest in improving the family home. That word, invest? As if this was some shared venture when they had made it clear I was just a guest. I stayed quiet for a few beats longer than I needed to, enough for Camille's smile to tighten. "I think you misunderstood," I finally said. "My suppliers don't deal in indoor materials." Camille leaned forward slightly. "But surely for family." And there it was, that old guilt rope being thrown across the table. Dad added, "You're doing so well, Ethan. It's not a gift, it's supporting the family home. Supporting. As if I hadn't supported this house every day since I was 16. I looked around the room at all the little symbols of their entitlement, the espresso machine that cost more than my first car, the new minimalist decor Camille curated to erase my mother's warmth, the crystal collection she displayed where my mom's old bookcase used to stand. 18 grand, I repeated, careful to keep my tone even. That's a lot for a bathroom remodel. Have you considered a home equity loan? They froze. We can't right now, Dad admitted. Credit's a bit tight, Camille added with that rehearsed, vague tone she always used when cornered. It all clicked in that moment. Their lifestyle wasn't sustainable. They weren't asking because they respected me or trusted me. They were desperate. Desperate enough to beg money from the same kid who had bailed them out silently for years. "Well," I said, standing up abruptly, "thanks for dinner." The chair scraped loudly across the floor and cut off whatever guilt-ridden protest was about to come out of Liam's mouth. "Early morning tomorrow." "Ethan, don't be dramatic." Camille sighed as I picked up my keys. Liam followed me out, his expression somewhere between confused and pleading. "Hey, I think they're just stressed about money. They miss you. I miss you." His loyalty was genuine but misdirected. "Yeah," I muttered. "We're all stressed, aren't we?" I left before I said something I couldn't take back. But even as I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about how Dad called this the family home, and yet it was never treated as such after Mom died. I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong. Not just the entitlement, the whole dynamic, the way they'd acted at dinner like I was an outsider. That gnawing suspicion was still with me the next morning when my assistant at the landscaping office brought in the mail and handed me an envelope from a law office, Peterson and Doyle property attorneys. Inside was a tax notice that nearly made me drop my coffee. The notice wasn't addressed to Dad, but to Camille as the sole owner of the property. My childhood home. The house I paid mortgage installments for was listed under her name alone. My hands shook as I called the number listed on the notice. The lawyer on the other end was polite, almost too polite, as he confirmed what the letter suggested. The property deed was transferred 5 years ago from Mr. Henry Foster to Ms. Camille Foster as a gift deed, he said smoothly. The records are clear. 5 years ago, when I was still covering their mortgage payments to help the family. I ended the call and sat there for a long minute staring at the wall of my office. The bathroom renovation request, the way Camille used the term family home, Dad's silence, suddenly all of it made horrifying sense. They had cut me out completely long ago. I was just a convenient ATM. Every visit, every favor, every guilt trip was part of the same story, take what they could until I finally walked away. But here's where everything changed. This wasn't going to end like all the other times where I just absorbed their betrayals. This time I had leverage. My business was thriving. I understood contracts, liens, and property rights far better than they realized. And I had one thing they didn't expect, a long memory and a long fuse that had just burned down to its final spark. That was when I made the decision. If they thought I was just a guest, then I'd act like one. I'd leave, but not before making sure this time I walked away with everything they assumed they had safely tucked away. I picked up the phone and made my first call a real estate lawyer I trusted. "Hey," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "I have a situation, and I need to know exactly what my options are if I wanted to buy a house that technically already belonged to me." As I ended that call, a calm I hadn't felt in years settled over me. A clarity. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't reacting to them. I was making the next move, and it was going to be my game from now on. That call to my lawyer wasn't just about legal advice, it was a line in the sand I never planned to cross until that moment. For years, I swallowed pride and resentment, convincing myself that walking away quietly was somehow noble. But that morning, staring at Camille's name on the deed to the only place that had ever felt like home, I realized nobility had kept me trapped. They treated me like a guest, fine. I'd exit, but on my terms, and I would take back what should have been mine all along. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet planning. I worked late at the office after my crews had left, combing through records and running numbers with my financial advisor. The irony was sharp, this house. The family home wasn't worth nearly what Camille probably imagined. She thought she had won the game holding title over a house she couldn't maintain and now couldn't afford to fix. But I wasn't planning to bail them out. This time I was preparing to buy them out completely and legally. Even more satisfying, their debts were stacking up faster than they realized. I pulled property records and discovered they had refinanced the house twice over the past 5 years, draining equity just to fund Camille's boutique yoga studio and wellness retreats that never turned a profit. It was all House of Cards financing, and the cards were about to tumble. But the deeper twist came as I dug further. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that Camille's studio wasn't just failing quietly, it was drowning. She was delinquent on rent, had defaulted on supplier invoices, and her clients, those wealthy suburban women who paid her to align their chakras, were fleeing as word spread about her sketchy credentials. Some had already filed complaints with the Better Business Bureau and consumer protection agencies. For years, Camille's power came from this illusion of serene success, this curated image of the polished woman who manifested abundance while living off the scraps of others. My father bought into it completely. But illusions only hold as long as no one looks too closely. I was looking very closely now. The symbolism of it all struck me as I sat late into the night sketching out what I would do if when I owned the house. I could almost see it stripping out every trace of Camille's cold beige minimalism, repainting the kitchen in the warm sunflower yellow Mom loved, restoring her garden exactly the way she designed it, down to the climbing roses along the back fence. Even the bench I built in her honor, the one Camille moved to the garage to make space for her meditation mats, would return to its rightful place under the old oak tree. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about reclaiming something sacred that they had desecrated in the name of moving on. Their brand of wellness was really about erasure. They didn't want to heal, they wanted to forget. But I remembered everything. When the house finally hit the market, listed at a price far below its actual worth, because Camille was desperate to cover mounting debts, I didn't hesitate. I put in an all-cash offer through my lawyer. Clean terms, fast closing, no contingencies. And then I sat back and waited. The moment the offer was accepted, I knew I had to see it through personally. I arranged to do the final walkthrough in person, insisting that the seller, Camille, be present. It wasn't legally required, but I made it a condition anyway. That house deserved witnesses when the tide turned. On the day of the walkthrough, I arrived at the house wearing work boots and jeans, not a suit. No pretense. I was claiming this place exactly as I was, the son they'd erased, the one who kept them afloat while they laughed about being manifestors. When Camille opened the door and realized I was the buyer, the color drained from her face. "You," she said, as if the universe itself had betrayed her. "Me," I replied, stepping inside without waiting for her permission. The house was half-packed boxes stacked hastily, the walls bare where her generic mindfulness artwork had hung. It felt hollow, but I could already imagine life returning to it, my mother's warmth seeping back into every corner. As we walked through each room, I made a point of noting everything aloud. This paint will go. The tile in here is coming out. That new tub not staying too sterile. I'll restore the original clawfoot. I saw Camille's mask begin to crack. "This is cruel," she snapped at one point, unable to maintain her usual pseudo-spiritual calm. "You're enjoying this." I stopped in the middle of the empty living room, the place where my mother once put up our Christmas tree, and looked her dead in the eye. "I'm not enjoying this," I said quietly, "but I am finishing it. You treated this house and me like temporary accessories to your life. You forgot who paid the bills when you couldn't. You forgot who rescued this place when you were too busy burning sage and redecorating." Her jaw tightened. She knew I wasn't wrong, but she couldn't admit it. Not now, not ever. And honestly, I didn't need her admission anymore. The final walkthrough ended in the kitchen, where Camille's designer espresso machine sat on the counter like a monument to her indulgence. "You can leave that if you like," I said casually. "Or take it. Either way, it won't stay long." Her eyes narrowed. "You're still bitter," she spat. "Not bitter," I corrected, reaching out to run a hand along the kitchen island my mother chose. "Clear." That clarity was the real twist, not just in this house, but in me. For so many years, I let myself believe that forgiveness meant silence, that peace meant stepping aside. But peace doesn't come from denial. It comes from truth and boundaries and justice. As I left that day, keys in hand, I paused at the threshold. The last time I had walked through that door as a resident, I was 16. Now, at 30, I was returning as the owner not just of the deed, but of my own story. And as the door closed behind me with a satisfying click, I felt this wasn't an ending. It was only the next chapter. Owning the house should have felt like triumph, but walking back through that front door now, legally mine, came with a strange weight. The rooms felt eerily quiet, stripped bare of Camille's furniture, yet also empty of the warmth my mother had once infused here. It wasn't home again, not yet. But it would be. My first act as owner was symbolic. I pulled open the windows to air out years of stale energy. The breeze swept through, carrying memories both beautiful and painful. I moved from room to room, noting where Mom's paintings once hung, where her favorite armchair used to sit by the window that overlooked her garden. I could almost hear her voice gently reminding me, "Start with small things, Ethan." So I did. I carried Camille's last remaining belongings, her crystal diffuser, a stack of mindfulness journals, and an abandoned yoga mat to the curb. Then I placed Mom's bench, the one I had built as a teenager, right back beneath the old oak tree. It was the first step in reclaiming this space, not just physically, but emotionally. But my work wasn't just inside these walls. Word spread quickly that Camille had lost her precious house to the very son she tried to erase. And as expected, my father showed up within a week, suitcase in hand, wearing an expression that hovered between shame and entitlement. "I just need a place to stay while I get back on my feet," he said, as if this was something he deserved. I stood in the doorway, keys jingling in my hand, unsure how to feel. After everything, the abandonment, the manipulation, the silent complicity, he was here asking for a room like nothing had happened. Part of me still carried that old reflexive guilt, that script drilled into me since I was 16, forgive, understand, provide. But I wasn't that kid anymore. "I can help you find an apartment," I said evenly, my voice steady. "Even help cover a security deposit. But you won't be staying here." The look in his eyes was shock at first, then a wounded confusion, as if he truly didn't understand why I would set this boundary. "This was your mother's house," I continued, stepping outside so he couldn't even cross the threshold. "And I'm making it right again. But this space, it's not yours anymore, Dad. Not after everything." He protested, muttering half-hearted apologies and promises that things would be different this time. But his words felt hollow. I knew he didn't mean them. I knew he hadn't really reflected on the choices that brought him here. This was just another chapter in his pattern: avoid accountability, depend on my sense of duty, wait for me to fix it all. I didn't slam the door when I turned him away, but I closed it firmly with finality. It was an act that felt risky, vulnerable, even because it forced me to confront one of my oldest beliefs, that family loyalty means enduring harm. But that belief had kept me trapped for too long, and it was time to rewrite it. The next weeks were filled with restoration, physical and emotional. I worked with my landscaping crew, personally supervising every detail of the garden's return. Every plant I chose was deliberate: my mother's favorite lavender by the walkway, climbing roses on the trellis, sunflowers beneath the kitchen window. These weren't just flowers. They were symbols, living proof that I could resurrect beauty even after years of neglect. Inside, I stripped every inch of Camille's sterile decor away. I repainted the walls in bold, warm colors, rehung framed photos of my childhood that I'd kept all these years, and brought back small touches that mattered: a crocheted blanket Mom once draped over the sofa, her ceramic tea set that I thought was lost but had found tucked in the attic, dusty but intact. I didn't rush any of it. I took my time, treating the house like an old friend who deserved care after years of abandonment. But even as I worked, I kept thinking about Liam. My younger brother hadn't been part of their schemes, but he also hadn't understood how deeply it all affected me. He had texted me a few times since the sale, mostly confused, asking why Camille and Dad seemed so bitter, why the house was suddenly gone from under them. Finally, one evening, I called him. "Come over," I said. "See for yourself." When Liam arrived, he stood in the doorway, almost nervously taking in the house with fresh eyes. "Wow," he said softly, moving from room to room. "It looks different, but it feels lighter too." We sat on the bench beneath the oak tree as twilight settled around us. For the first time in years, I told him everything: the mortgage payments I'd made at 16, Dad signing over the house behind my back, the years of guilt trips and manipulations. I didn't tell him to choose sides. I just told the truth, plain and simple. Liam sat quietly for a long time, his face thoughtful. "I had no idea," he finally said, sounding more like a grown man than the carefree little brother I remembered. "They always made it sound like you were distant, cold. I didn't realize how much you did for all of us." That acknowledgement wasn't everything, but it was enough. We talked late into the night about life, about Dad, about the meaning of home. I could feel something shift as we spoke, an understanding that hadn't existed before. Maybe we could build something new from here. Maybe not as brothers trapped in a toxic family system, but as two adults creating something better. That was the real legacy I wanted. Not revenge, not bitterness, but a place where the cycle could break. When he left that night, I stayed out on the bench alone for a while longer, listening to the wind through the branches. The garden lights I'd installed glowed softly around me, casting shadows that felt peaceful instead of haunting. This was the house's first true evening of peace in years. As I locked up for the night, I realized that the house wasn't the only thing being restored. I was too. Piece by piece, boundary by boundary, I was coming back to myself. This wasn't the end of the story, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what came next.